We obviously heard quite a lot there on some very broad areas, and we do want to discuss policy today. So I just thought we might start off actually on the infrastructure area, and it's obviously been a big part of the campaigns to date and will continue to be so, I assume. Now, we've heard a lot about the spending. I'm wondering about the funding, and I just wonder if we can maybe start with you, Premier. So you outlined quite a broad program there, a $2 billion infrastructure package. Something like the Spencer Gulf port, how will that be funded, and why is that happening now?
Yeah, we'll be saying more about that in the coming weeks. Obviously, we're laying out the details of our plans throughout the course of the campaign. But in broad terms, what we've seen is a range of private sector proponents since the privatisation of our Ports Authority who have talked about the need for a port, but really the private sector hasn't been able to deliver one. So we've decided that it's time to step up and use the capacities of government to invest, and we'll be doing that in partnership with the private sector, and we'll be making some announcements about that very soon. In terms of our capacity to do that, running essentially budget surpluses, making sure that we are prudent in the management of the state resources has given us the capacity to invest in this way.
Stephen, a little earlier we
just on that, can I just make the comment? Look, the reality is there's more capital than there are projects in the world at the moment. The cost of capital is the lowest it's pretty much ever been. But the critical thing is providing certainty. And this is what Labor hasn't done. It hasn't developed, like every other state in Australia, a 20-year productive infrastructure plan. So why is the private sector going to put a port in on the Spencer Gulf if there's no certainty that that's part of the state's plan? There could be another port put in 50 kilometres down the coast. The reality is, if the government came up with a plan in consultation with the private sector, you would find that the private sector would co-invest, the feds would co-invest, maybe even local government would co-invest, and we would have the productive infrastructure that we so desperately need in South Australia.
Well, tell us about your plans then and your core sort of infrastructure.
Well, for 5 years, we've made it very clear we need to adopt best practice. I mean, it was a federal Labor government which put this in place through Infrastructure Australia. It was a suggestion from Kevin Rudd. He's put it in place. We think it makes a lot of logical sense because it does provide certainty to the private sector and to Infrastructure Australia. And let me tell you the consequences of not doing it. And this is really critical. And this has been the deliberate policy of this Labor government. They failed to develop a long-range plan. They've failed to submit plans to Infrastructure Australia so that they can do two things. One, whinge that the federal governments haven't funded infrastructure projects in South Australia, but how can they fund projects that haven't been submitted? But secondly, it maximises the unencumbered GST distribution to South Australia so that they can get this unencumbered money and beat up the federal government. And from the political perspective, it makes logical sense. But from a practical perspective for South Australia, it's been an absolute disaster.
And what are your priorities then?
Well, we've made it clear we're going to develop a long-range plan for each of these critical areas: road, rail, ports, airports, water augmentation, electricity augmentation. And when we released our 100-day plan, one of the first items on that was moving heaven and earth to set up Infrastructure SA as quickly as possible.
Well, we're actually going to build one rather than just talk about it.
But you've said that for 16 years. You've said it for 16 years, and in fact in 2011 you said you were going to fast track it. See, there we go again. We're sick to death of waiting for the private sector. No responsibility from government, no concept of working in partnership or collaboration, and this is what's holding South Australia back.
I'll just make the point in terms of Infrastructure SA, and I think the government, as I understand it, doesn't believe the need for a specific infrastructure body. The opposition supports establishing Infrastructure SA or Building SA, whatever you want to call it. But the distinction in terms of SA Best's position, we're saying that we should follow the recommendation of Consult Australia, which says that it should have real teeth, that it should make recommendations that cannot be overturned by government unless it's by the Parliament itself, because that way you get that additional rigour in the process to ensure that we deal with major infrastructure projects dispassionately to maximise the state's productivity and have appropriate advice.
And so what are the plans for you?
Well, I think
SABS.
firstly we need to get the process right, but the key, and I think the Upper Spencer Gulf, the port facility is long overdue. That will be a good thing in terms of unlocking our mining and agriculture potential in terms of exports, because we have lagged behind with exports. I think Stephen is right. We've got about half the growth of exports of the rest of the country in the last 15 years. So these are the sorts of issues that we need to look at. But we need to have a process where it's done well, it's done on budget, and it's done with appropriate advice from experts rather than politicians.
Look, I've got to take this point up about us having a falling share of exports. It's a classic example of both of you deciding to talk down South Australia and focus on cherry-picking some statistics which suit your purpose. This is the truth about exports. Western Australia's share of national merchandise exports has increased by 24.8% to 42%. Why? Because of the massive growth in the resources sector in that state. So every other state, with the exception of Queensland, which has also had a bit of a mini boom, has basically had a falling share of exports. So Victoria's share of national exports fallen from 16.9% to 8.6%. You've got New South Wales share falling from 7.8% to 15%. So what you do is you single out South Australia as having had a falling share of exports, but every other state in the nation has had...
Every other state
except Queensland, which has also had mining...
Except Queensland and except Western Australia, and then you just identified another one that fell by a very small fraction.
Because you've got this massive mining boom in some states, and necessarily the other states are going to have a smaller share. Their exports have still grown. They're just going to be a smaller share of the proportion. It's cherry-picking statistics. You spoke for 10 minutes, and in the end, you said this is a great state. That was the only positive thing you said about...
Let down by a government with no ambition.
Well, but this is the difficulty. I think people believe strongly that this state is going in a positive direction, and the worst thing we need is somebody that talks it down.
Can we change gear for a moment then? Because one thing that I think is really fascinating, especially to people, in fact, outside the boundaries of the state, over the last 12 months, the state and Commonwealth governments have had, should we say, a robust debate on a number of areas. It'd be interesting to hear from each of you how after March 17, depending on the result, how you would manage that, because obviously any part of the political divide nonetheless has to manage that relationship. So a slightly different question for you, because you've maybe a lessons learned, but interesting.
Well, look, you don't get anything if you don't stand up. And we've seen that with the river. We were being asked by Stephen and his colleagues to settle for 2,750 gigalitres. We fought for 3,200. We didn't roll over on submarines. I was being asked to settle for surface ships, but we fought for future subs. We haven't rolled over on any of the big issues. We're asked to scrap our renewable energy target by Stephen. We said no, we're not going to scrap it, we're going to keep investing in it. You need somebody in this job that's prepared to stand up for South Australia, not roll over and have their tummy tickled by Canberra. And that's basically what we're doing. We've got Stephen and Nick joined up and cooperated with the federal government's $210 million cuts to school education funding. We are continuing the fight to make sure that we get every last dollar of funding to our schools. And I think that's what South Australians want, somebody that's prepared to stand up for them.
Stephen, how would you approach
Look, I think from time to time you do have to stand up to Canberra, regardless of who is in power. But one of the critical areas that you've got to do when you're in government is take responsibility, not always to shift the blame to somebody else. And that has been 16 years, and certainly the last 6 years under Premier Weatherill. The reality is we've got to work in collaboration to achieve our full potential. And too often, especially over the last 6 years, where we haven't achieved our full potential, it's been somebody else's problem, somebody else's fault, whether it's a public servant, it's the private sector, it's Josh Frydenberg, it's, the commodity prices. At some point, and everybody that is in business in this room knows that the buck has to stop somewhere, and it's got to stop at the top.
So are you saying you pick your fights?
Absolutely, and every business person knows exactly this. There are times to stand up and fight, and there are some times that you need to collaborate. And at this point, the government just doesn't know the difference. And the Premier's sort of his cited example is that we haven't stood up to defend a state-based renewable energy target, even though he knows full well that it's against the express recommendation of Professor Finkel. It's against the recommendation of the Clean Energy Council. I mean, it's Jay Weatherill's fight. It's not a good fight. It's damaged South Australia, and we certainly won't be going back to a state-based renewable energy target.
So I'm concerned that we haven't seen the report to the Treasurer in terms of the GST share for South Australia, because that could have a profound impact on the state's economy. We need to see that sooner rather than later, and I think the federal government needs to rule out changing that formula in any way that would damage South Australia's economy in terms of receipts. On the issue of education, I kept getting beaten up by the Premier on that. The fact is this: when David Gonski, the architect of the Gonski Review, and his panel said, if you don't pass this package, which included an extra $4.9 billion I negotiated with my colleagues for the nation, $422 million for South Australia, it would have been a disaster for students. We actually embedded in a number of mechanisms to ensure better outcomes for our students, to remove disadvantage. When Diane Foggo, a former head of the AEU and national president of the AEU, said, for goodness sakes, pass this package because this is going to make a very big difference. I will always fight for South Australia. Jay marks me down on that. When it came to water back in 2009 with the Rudd government and the Rand government back then was very helpful. I held out for almost $1 billion in water payments that was largely beneficial to South Australia. And on the subs, I think everyone knows that I've worked well with all sides of politics to make sure we get that defence spending here.
Can I talk? There are some positive areas of cooperation that I think probably do need to be mentioned. Surprisingly, Tony Abbott had a retreat with all of the state premiers, and we talked about probably one of the single biggest challenges, which is the question of health reform. The critical issues for our public hospitals is the entry points and the exit points. I mean, this is the big challenge. How do you get the primary healthcare system to avoid people with chronic illnesses really crowding out our public hospitals? We don't control that, the Commonwealth does. In terms of exit points, the Commonwealth has the aged care facilities. And we put in place a set of arrangements which were about trying to actually manage chronic diseases. So GPs who don't have an incentive at the moment to really get into the chronic disease area in terms of respiratory health, mental disability, diabetes, things that are chronic diseases that have got our hospitals really very full. Now, that's gone nowhere, sadly. When he left, it fell away. But we need to get back to that agenda, and it looked very prospective. And sadly, it's fallen away.
Yeah, so there is hope there.
Can I just make a point? Being at Modbury Hospital today, one of the clinicians who didn't want to be seen publicly speaking to me said, in what other public hospital, any hospital around the country, do you have 35,000 emergency admissions each year and not have an HDU, a high dependency unit? And I think that was quite telling.
Mm-hmm. What can you tell this audience about, obviously a massive issue for everyone, which is reliable and lower cost energy? We've talked about energy in a variety of different ways now, but I wonder how you can articulate to this audience how you would, how you would lay out what you would do to deliver that, because it's so essential and it's such a contentious issue that we've been hearing about so much in this state. So I'd love to hear from each of you to kind of give us a sense of...
Look, I'm happy to kick off. Look, The reality is the Liberal Party accept that we're moving towards more renewable energy in South Australia. Where our beef with the government is the management of the transition to that. They had an opportunity to keep Alinta in place to manage that transition so that we didn't have these massive spikes in cost in South Australia. The government rejected that. They pushed ahead. We've now got this abundance of wonderful intermittent renewable energy, and only now they're saying, actually, we need some baseload or we need some storage in South Australia. All of that work should have been done. All of that work could have been done, and we could have actually been world leaders instead of what we have now, which is, I think, putting the cause of renewable energy back here in South Australia, because the government has mismanaged this. The Liberal Party says that we would have an interconnector with New South Wales, which would do two things: allow baseload to come into South Australia to support our intermittent renewable energy when it's needed, but also create a highway for the export of our renewable energy. And we'll also put more money, $150 million, into storage, home-based and grid-scale storage in South Australia. The centre point of the Labor Party's energy policy is a $400 million plus diesel generator and conversion to an emergency standby gas-fired generator because they have no confidence in the stability of the grid. Now, we think that that emergency 250 megawatts of power could be provided by the private sector far more cost effectively and not encumber our balance sheet with $440 million worth of spending in this area. We'd rather see the money going into an interconnector, greater storage in South Australia, and we're the only party in South Australia who has put our policy out for independent assessment. ACIL Allen have said that our policy settings would bring the wholesale price in South Australia down by a further 24%, which will flow through to lower costs for households and businesses. Now, I don't agree with Jay Weatherill's energy policy. He's got one. This guy, who wants to be the Premier of South Australia, will hold the balance of power, and the polls open in less than 2 weeks. You promised an energy policy last year, January, first week in February, last Friday at the latest. This morning I heard you on the radio, it's going to be today. What is it?
It's tomorrow morning. Well, I'm sorry. Come along. I'll give you the time. Do you want to know the time?
Well, I've heard so many dates. I keep fronting up.
It's been done. Well, it's been done, and it's tomorrow morning.
Okay. Well, perhaps while Nick works that out, perhaps I can say, look, I mean, you could have a choice, Stephen. You could actually say that you're proud of our international leadership in renewable energy. Because I've got to say, the majority of South Australians are. They are proud that we've got the world's largest lithium-ion battery. They are proud of the fact that we've got the world's largest solar thermal project, which is a game changer in terms of basically renewable energy which has baseload storage. They are proud of the fact that we're running a distributed energy system through the 50,000 virtual power station, which is going to put downward pressure on prices. That is exactly what's happening. Indeed, it's already happening. The Australian Market Energy Commission, the national independent regulator, is out there forecasting $300 reduction over the next 2 years. Why? Because of new renewable energy projects coming online. And when you had a crack, I mean, we had to wait, you had to go at Nick for his energy plan. You promised yours for well over 6 months, and you kept messing every deadline. And then the day you did announce it, you said it would save South Australians $300, and then within 24 hours you had to admit you got it wrong, and it would only save between $50 or $60 in 2 terms. That's what you said publicly. Please don't try and weasel out of it right here, because we've got you on tape. So this is, you rang every single South Australian, and you have your little robocall, and you told them it was going to save them $300. Then you went on television, swallowed your tongue, and actually had to cough up that it was $50 to $60 in 2 terms' time.
Having negotiated with Matthias Cormann to secure the $110 million concessional equity loan, which I think all of us are in furious agreement for the solar thermal plant, that is actually a very good thing, because it's reliable, dispatchable renewable energy, because that is the future. You need to have that dispatchability built in to future projects, in my view, whether it's with battery storage or hydro or solar thermal. That will make a big difference. Yeah. Going to Stephen's point, I think there have been issues of the transition. If you're going to do renewables, do it right. There were 2 reports to the Department of Premier and Cabinet back in 2009, before Jay was Premier, the potential for renewable energy in South Australia by MMA, and the NIEIR report, the future prospects for renewable energy in South Australia. Essentially what they said, if you're going to do it well, make sure there's grid stability, make sure that you've got proper planning in place. And I fear that that could have been done better. My view is that we need to look at issues of the power of the gentailers in terms of their market power. You need to ensure greater supply, and of course it needs to be based on renewables, in my view, given that the prices come down significantly. But I'll say this, if SA Best is in a balance of power position, then holding whomever forms government to account to targets to reduce power prices and ensure reliability will be a very key issue for us, because that is fundamental. I'm optimistic that we will see a downward pressure on prices and better reliability, but we need to have some ambitious goals to ensure that industry can be more competitive.
Okay, and tomorrow morning?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to come along?
What time and where?
You heard it here.
Well,
We're going to have
I'll
to...
fit in with
No,
you.
just
I'll fit in
what
with you.
time and where?
Probably about 11 o'clock. When do you want to do it? Do you want to come along?
Right, 11 o'clock.
Why not?
You're welcome.
Why not?
We are going to
You're
have to
welcome.
wind up, I'm afraid. Could you please thank Nick Xenophon, Stephen Buckwood, Greg Weatherill.